Everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Russell Shorto. I am the director of the New Amsterdam Project, and I'm curator of the exhibit New York Before New York, the Castello Plan of New Amsterdam. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, the Frederick Douglass Council, and all of our members and our other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. This program will last about 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. You can submit questions at any time via the Q&A function on your screen. We have disabled the chat, so don't use chat. Make sure you use Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. Lastly, I am pleased to say that there has been a great turnout for tonight's program, and the powers that be are curious as to what sparks people's interest. So before we begin, you may hear my dog barking in the background. Before we begin, we would like to take a quick poll to see what interests you most about New York before New York. You should see the poll pop up on your screen right now. Please select which option is the most applicable to you. New York City history, pre-revolutionary period history, maps, all of the above, or other. Unfortunately, there's no writing option. So we'll take a moment here and please do vote, and we will, and somebody somehow will tabulate these results, and we'll get kind of a quick snapshot of your interests. 41% said New York history, 20% said pre-revolutionary history, 15% said maps, 50% said all of the above. So I don't know how much that tells us. It tells us that New York Historical has an audience of people who are interested in New York history and in maps. So, okay, wonderful. All right, thanks for participating in that. Let's go into the program. So Perry, if you would cue up the PowerPoint. Thank you. This is, so let me just tell you that this came about because this year, 2024, is the 400th anniversary of the founding of New Netherland, which was a Dutch colony with its capital of New Amsterdam on Manhattan. The capital itself wasn't founded for another 2 years. So what that means is that we are going to be doing programming related to New York's Dutch founding in 2024, in 2025, and in 2026. So there are other things you can look forward to. So this is a mock-up of the exhibit. It's actually up now. So well, I could have taken a photograph, but a couple of days ago, this is what I had. Next slide, please. And the exhibit is in 3 parts. One part is the whole back wall of the lobby, which has a number of artifacts relating to the Dutch period in New York's history. Next slide. And then the other 2 parts on the left here is a virtual screen that allows you to virtually enter New Amsterdam. And in this case, in the middle are 3 very special objects that we have on loan. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the Castello Plan, which is the object that we have given pride of place in the subtitle of the exhibit. The Castello Plan was created at the height of New Amsterdam in about 1660. The city council also conducted a census. So we are able, with these 2 things together, to determine a great deal of information about this little city that was the seed from which New York City grew. There are a little over 300 houses here. We know the names of the owners of all the houses. We know most of the people who lived in them at various times, including at this time. You can see the fort there is the most prominent building across and I should point out that the Castello Plan is oriented so that south is to the left. We would normally look at Manhattan Island as a long feature, but here south is to the left. And so that largest street running up the top of the map and off to the right, it was originally the Wakaskek Trail, a native trail, which the Dutch paved and called the Hereweg, the gentleman's way, and then the English called it Broadway. So this is the base of Broadway here. You can see the two canals in the town there, and of course at the right there you see the boundary, the wall that was built, and the wall itself was really more of a fence. It wasn't terribly special. It is most notable because the street along which it ran became Wall Street. Next slide. So the exhibit then, it really is an attempt to use the Castello Plan to unpack it. What was this world? What was this community? Who were these people? And we didn't just want to tell a Dutch story. We didn't want to tell simply a European story. Obviously, when the Europeans came here, there were people who'd been living here for centuries, the native peoples. And the first thing that the Dutch did was enter into negotiations and negotiate deeds, property deeds. The property deed for Manhattan Island doesn't exist anymore. It's been lost. But what we have is sort of the next best thing, is this very rare letter, which we have on loan from the Dutch National Archives in The Hague. It's called the Peter Schagen letter. Peter Schagen was a Dutch government official. And in 1626, they entered into some sort of agreement with probably a branch of the Lenape or Munsee people. And then the next ship that went home, this official visited the ship, saw the cargo on the ship, and wrote home. The next slide, please. This is a translation of the letter, and you can see that list of items. He's reporting all the animal, the beaver furs, and so on that were on the ship. He says, our people are in good spirits, the women are giving birth, and then I made in red there the kind of money line of the letter. They have purchased the island Manhattas from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders. This is the famous, the infamous $24 purchase. In the 19th century, a translator would convert that to 19th century dollars, and hence we have this I think mistaken notion that the Dutch bought the island of Manhattan for $24 from the native people. In fact, it wasn't a purchase, and the Dutch knew that. They knew that the native people didn't have that kind of understanding of property. It was more like a defensive alliance. It was a land use agreement, and this amount of goods value to the value of 60 guilders was more in the nature of symbolic to seal this agreement between the two. The next slide, please. So what I tried very hard, what I really wanted to do was so we have the letter, as you saw in this case, this actual momentous letter, and then we have a translation there of it that you can read. And I wanted to get one or more Lenape leaders of today to reflect on that letter, which has been so profoundly changed the course of their history. And I was fortunate enough to present my case to a group of Lenape leaders on a Zoom call, and they agreed to write a statement. So you don't have to read this whole statement here. You can see it when you see the exhibit, but they chose to address themselves to the unnamed ancestor of theirs who entered into this bargain, this negotiation with the Dutch, saying, ancestor, we do not know your name or the family you come from, but we know we are connected. They go on to talk about, further down, who could have known that a Dutch colonizer's written words and 60 guilders would bring 400 years of devastation, disease, war, forced removal, oppression, murder, division, suicide, and generational trauma for your Lenape people. It's needless to say, it's a very powerful statement that they made. And these are, it is signed by 3 Lenape chiefs, one from the Nanticoke, who are in Delaware, New Jersey, one from the Ramapo, who are in New Jersey, and the third group is in Ontario. And we're very grateful to them for their willingness to participate in this exhibit. Next slide, please. So this item is also on loan from the Dutch National Archives, also very rare. In 1664, someone did a sketch of the city of New Amsterdam, and they sent it to Amsterdam. And a well-known illustrator there named Johannes Vingbones created this rather lyrical watercolor of it. But in the, took months to travel. And in that interim, the English had taken over New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. So you actually see that reflected here up at the top. It says New Amsterdam, or now New York on the island of Manhattan. So this, in addition to being the lyrical little image of the place, it also captures that sense, that moment of takeover. Next slide. Another very special item that we have in the exhibit is called an mpungu. We have it on loan from the New York State Museum. Peter Stuyvesant was the last director of the Dutch colony. He was in charge for the last 17 years. And his right-hand man was Cornelis van Tienhoven. Van Tienhoven lived in New Amsterdam. As I said, thanks to the Castello Plan, we know where everyone lived, and we know his house. And in 1984, archaeologists were digging in that area, and just outside the house is a little alleyway, and they found buried below the ground level this basket. This is a plaster cast of a basket that was in the ground, and it was filled with objects. These are marbles, pipes, pipe stems, animal bones, a whole collection of different objects, and it was covered with a Dutch Delftware plate. And I have spoken to an African art history expert named Barbaro Martinez Ruiz, who is at Oxford University, who tells me that this is called an mpungu. It's from the Congo region, and it was a collection of objects intended for healing. It could be for healing a person, for healing a society, and it was an expert interacted with it on a regular, typically on a weekly basis. So you would take the lid off and interact with these objects. So this, to me, because it's frustrating when you're trying to put together an exhibit like this, because you don't, I mean, we've got lots of material remains from the Europeans, from the elite, from the Dutch, the leaders, but we have very little from the Africans or from the native people. So this is, to me, quite a precious collection, because it gives evidence of that presence and of agency. You know, these people were there and they were continuing. Many of them were Christians, because the Africans were from a part of Africa that had been colonized by Portugal, and they were Catholics, actually. But they also, many of them, continued their traditional practices, and this is evidence of that. Next slide, please. This is a stained glass window. The church was a center of life in the Dutch colony. This example, this window, is actually from the Dutch Reformed Church in Beverwijk, which became Albany, so up the river. But the windows would have been very similar to this. A great percentage of the population, including the enslaved, attended worship, baptized their children, got married there, and we have those records. So we have a great deal of information about that as well. Next slide. This is New York Historical's own portrait of Peter Stuyvesant. We don't know the name of the artist. He was a complex figure. He was very capable. He, in my research, I find that in the early going, when he came aboard, it was at a very contentious time in the life of the colony. And he was a very stern, he was the son of a Calvinist minister, and he tried to exert kind of an iron rule, and he was rebuffed. People really resisted it. I think then over the next several years, he learned how to govern this place. New Amsterdam was a very unusual place. The Dutch had this policy of tolerance, and there were famously more than 18 languages spoken in New Amsterdam, and that was at a time when there were only about 500 people there. So as I like to say, New York was New York even before it was New York. And Stuyvesant learned over time how to manage this this contentious, this very independent-minded populace. Next slide. This photograph doesn't do justice. If you see it in the case, this log, it's enormous. This was a piece of the canal. I showed you on the plan that there were two canals. They were actually natural streams in Lower Manhattan. And they tried to do what they did back home, which was to control those bodies of water. And because it was in a population center, they became something like open sewers, which wasn't very pleasant, couldn't have been very pleasant. On the other hand, because these streams, we were right down there in the harbor, and with the ebb and flow of the tide, they were constantly being flushed out. This also is an item that has been in New York Historical's collection for a long time. Next slide. These are two coins. They are called dalders, which is related to the word dollar. A dalder was a portion of a guilder. The guilder was the main currency in the Dutch Republic. And so a dalder was like a quarter or a dime. However, what is interesting about them to me is that you had dalders, you had guilders, you had Spanish money, you had doubloons, and you had pieces of eight. It was a very international place. But currency wasn't the main currency, so to speak. People came to the colony typically from somewhere in Europe with a promise. You would go to a company or a bank and you would put something down. You would put down money. They would give you a promissory note. Then when you showed up in New Amsterdam, you would give it to the West India Company, and they would give you credit. So then so it was a credit-based system. It also operated, confusingly enough, on beaver pelts. The beaver, if there was one unit of currency, it was probably the beaver pelt. And as well on wampum, that is to say, the ceremonial beads that the native people wove, that the Dutch made into currency as well. So it's a very complicated currency situation, which befits a place that, even though it was very small, and as you saw in the Vingbones illustration, was very, well, kind of looked like a little village, a primitive village. It was founded to be an entrepot, that is a global trade center. So it's one of the remarkable things of history is that later the World Trade Center would be built there at this very spot, which was set up to be that. Next slide. We have two wedding rings in the exhibit, and they have magnifying glasses over them so you can really zoom in on the details. And what's interesting about them to me is that both of these weddings took place in the later 1600s. That is, it's New York now. We're no longer in the Dutch period. However, the style of both rings makes plain that both of them were made in the Dutch period. So you had people, when a woman died, her daughter would inherit her ring. So you had that kind of continuity. So this suggests the continuity of this Dutch elite into the New York period, into the 1700s and into the 1800s. Many of these people who had been part of the elite of New Amsterdam, their children would become part of the elite in New York. And in fact, New York Historical Society's founders in 1804, a number of them were descended back to New Amsterdam. Next slide. This is, so Peter Stuyvesant had an estate, a farm, uptown in what's now the East Village, a boerderij, which is the Dutch word for farm, and the corruption of that is bowery. It was a large estate, and he loved fruit trees, in particular pear trees, and he imported them from the Netherlands. In the early 1800s, Now, a lot of history has gone by. The city is becoming urban, and the urban grid is moving uptown. And that same area, what is now 13th Street and 3rd Avenue, someone realized that there was one old pear tree standing there that was the last remaining piece of Peter Stuyvesant's farm. So people had this awareness of, of the Dutch history behind them. So the city built a little fence around to protect it. And then in 1867, a wagon crashed into it, knocked it down. And that piece of land was actually still owned by a descendant of Stuyvesant's who had this slice cut and donated it to the New York Historical Society. Next slide. This book is called The Beschrijvingen van Nieuw Nederland, The Description of New Netherland. It was written by Adrian van der Donck, one of the most fascinating members of the colony. He wrote this book to promote America, to promote this new world colony in the home country and in Europe. And indeed, it became something of a bestseller. He described, he was a great propagandist. He described, he said that the trees there in America are taller, the animals are bigger, the fruit is sweeter. He was very thoughtful in his descriptions of the native peoples. He talked about how they conjugate their verbs and how women give birth. And so it was, thanks to this book, hundreds of people actually read it and boarded ships and emigrated. So this book actually helped to spur population growth. There were two editions of it, and New York Historical has both editions, and we have one of them in the exhibit. Next slide. This is a property deed given to an formerly enslaved African man named Manuel de España. The whole question of slavery, what it was, how it operated in the Dutch colony is, I don't have time to go into it here. It's a very interesting story because this is before slavery is institutionalized. The slave codes in New York would come into being much later in 1701, which would make set up rules for how enslaved people could function and would severely limit them. In the Dutch period, I mean, slavery was still slavery, don't get me wrong, but it was enslaved people were able, for example, to petition for if something was wrong. They were able to go to court and sue. They were also able to go to court and sue for their freedom, and a number of them did that. And this man, Manuel de España, did. He was owned by an individual. Some were owned by the West India Company, tied to the person who had owned you, in the sense that you had to pay them for a period of time. So that was the case here, and what they would do typically is give the person a certain amount of property so that they could grow crops and pay themselves off. So this is a property deed that the company granted to this particular man. Next slide. This mandamus is also in the collection of New York Historical. There was a horrific war. The Dutch were there, I should underscore. The Dutch were in America, in New York, what became New York, in order to trade with the native peoples. The natives peoples would trap furs. The Dutch traded for them and then shipped the furs back to Europe. And so it was, they needed them as business partners. Nevertheless, a terrible war broke out in the 1640s for 2 years, more than 2 years, and hundreds of people died on both sides. And at the end of it, Willem Kieft, who was the director of the colony, was shipped home, and that's when Peter Stuyvesant came to take his place. Two colonists in particular, excuse me, my phone is making noise. Two colonists in particular essentially sued, and they wrote to the government complaining that the Dutch had declared this war on the natives unjustly, and that these two colonists, had their property destroyed. So this mandamus was the company and the Dutch government agreeing with them and saying that the West India Company and its directors had in fact been unjust in declaring this war. Next slide. This is a deed of property to a man named Hobart Lockermans, who was, he's the kind of rags to riches story that New York has been famous for, and he was one of the first. He came as a poor youngster, and he grew to be one of the richest men in the colony. And this deed was for property in what's now Canarsie, and it exemplifies this opportunity that was available, provided that you were white and European and male. Next slide. This map, the Dutch created this map in the 1650s, and it was considered so accurate that for the better part of a century, everyone, the Dutch, the English, the French, viewed this as the map of the northeast portion of North America, And so it went through 28 different editions, each one with changes and additions. This is in the New York Historical Collection. It's a rare second state of the map. And you can see sort of near the top, it says Nova Belgica, which is Latin for New Netherland. And then it says New Nederland, which is New Netherland in Dutch. So that you can see the wide swath of territory they were claiming for themselves. And to the right of that, maybe difficult to read, it says New Engeland. So along the coast there was the land that they were acknowledging, okay, the English are over there in New England, but we've got this huge swath with the Hudson River going up the middle of it. Next slide. This has intrigued scholars for a long time. This is an engraving by a Dutch artist from the 17th century, possibly of a Lenape man. There is a scholar named George Hamill who wrote, who'd researched this, and he believes that this man is someone who was captured by the Dutch during Keith's War, and two Dutch soldiers took him to Amsterdam and put him on view, on exhibition for money. He was called, they called him Jacques. Whether that was his name, I'm not sure if that was a corruption of it. So this may be a portrait of that particular Lenape man, and it's intriguing because we have so few objects and items, let alone a portrait of the native people of the time. Next slide. In the exhibit, we did 3 profiles of people from the colony, and this image is meant to represent one of those profiles, a man named Sequanamo, who was an Esopus leader. The Esopus were a tribe just north of Manhattan, up the Hudson River, and they sometimes lived in longhouse villages like this. And then after European contact, they built fences around them. They tried to protect themselves. And Sequanamo was notable because he appears a number of times in the records as a leader of tribes that band together and are going to negotiate with the Dutch. And in the 1660s, he negotiated with Peter Stuyvesant a treaty that ended a period of bloodshed. Next slide. This is, I'm sorry, I'm realizing now this photograph is a little blurry, but this is a petition. The Dutch colony, as I mentioned, was very diverse for the time. It had a sizable population of Jews. Asser Levy was the first Jew to arrive in the colony in 1654, and 2 weeks later, a group of 23 other Jews coincidentally showed up. They had come from Brazil. The Dutch had controlled Brazil. It fell to the Portuguese. The Dutch had been relatively tolerant towards Jews, and the Portuguese were anything but. So these people got on this ship and eventually made their way to New Amsterdam, and they sought refuge there. So the Dutch tolerance was a thing, but it was a very limited thing, and it depended. In this case, it depended on the leader. Peter Stuyvesant didn't think much of Jews. He also didn't like Lutherans. Um, and he tried to make life miserable for them. So one of the things that he did was he told them they couldn't be burghers. A burgher was a citizen of a city. They were not allowed to be burghers. Now, burghers, one of the things that a burgher, one of the privileges of a burgher was to serve on the burgher guard. So kind of the police force. A group of them every night would walk around the town and make sure people were safe. So they couldn't be burghers. They couldn't serve on the burgher guard, but they were taxed as if they were taxed for not taking part in the sort of fined for not taking part in the burgher guard. So Asser Levy, in this and in a number of other instances, became the leader of the Jews, the representative for them, petitioned in court and said, this isn't right. We should be allowed to either serve as burghers or not be taxed. Eventually, he won his case. This is a petition in which they said that the city council ruled, or rather Stuyvesant ruled, that in fact, they weren't going to have any of it. They could leave if they wanted to, but they were overruled and they won their case. Next slide. This is another petition from an enslaved African named Dorothea Angola. She and her husband had earlier adopted an orphan boy named Anthony. Anthony is now 18. They are older. And according to the rules that the Dutch had set up, which were very fluid, if they were to die, the West India Company could take him back into slavery. So they petitioned that he would remain free in that event, and they won the case. So this is an example of this agency that, to some extent, blacks had in the colony. Next slide. Okay, that was a quick overview of the exhibit. I wanted to tell you also about March 20th. We have a panel discussion at New York Historical. I'll be moderating it, and I will be leading the scholars Deborah Hamer, Nicole Maskill, and Robert O'Dowd Porter, and we will be talking about the interplay between the Dutch, the native, and the African populations of the colony, and how that limited tolerance played out at the time, and how those factors have remained a part of not just New York's, but American history ever since. I think I have one more slide here. And just a reminder that that's what we're talking about. This is New Amsterdam. It's the financial district of New York. You see Battery Park there. Battery Park is landfill. So really picture the cluster of skyscrapers, and you're looking at New Amsterdam. And it never ceases to amaze me that what began at the Castello Plan, this is what it became. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. And I think, let me see how we're doing here with questions. We have to go to Q&A. We've got a few questions. If anybody has questions, please chime in. Okay, someone asks, when was the church window created? Excellent. You've started off with a question that I do not have the answer to. It was created sometime during the Dutch period, whether it was in the it was probably later in the period, probably in the 1650s or 60s, but I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that. Were the Dutch ever called upon to honor their 1626 military alliance with the Lenape? I think that the short answer to that is yes. And they did, you know, I was talking about this alliance with the Lenape with regard to Manhattan, but the Dutch, I believe the figure is about 600. The scholar Robert Grummet, who's written a lot about the Lenape people, calculates that the Dutch entered into 600 separate deeds for land with the Lenape and people in what's now the greater New York region. So each one of them would have initially, in the early going, involved a kind of military alliance. However, after the first period, after the first 10 or 20 years, that shifted. And the Dutch, I think, sort of got tired of that, tired of playing that game. And you see that too on the part of the native people, because they later in the life of the colony, and certainly in the New York period, they realize that when they're making these deals, they are literally going to have to move somewhere else. So you see that change taking place. If Stuyvesant was a bit of an authoritarian, why do we name a neighborhood and high school after him? I think people are asking this question right now. You know, he was not only an authoritarian, he was actively involved. He began the slave trade, what became a very robust slave trade in New York. It was not robust under the Dutch, but he set it in motion. So there are very good reasons for asking yourselves that. On the other hand, if I take the other side, he set in motion, and he held this thing together, this complex multi-ethnic society powered by what we would call capitalism. So, maybe he deserves something for that. I'm just kind of playing the devil's advocate here. I think these are the kinds of questions that you have to ask. Were Native people enslaved as well by the WIC? Yes, there were Native people enslaved, and that's another side of this whole complex puzzle of slavery. And so the questions relate to what it was and who was enslaved and under what conditions. Of course, slavery was not anything like what it would be later when the sort of you're gone with the wind image of slavery. Typically, it was a household with one enslaved person or a farm with a couple of people. So it was it wasn't like a plantation style thing. Okay, the war declared by the Dutch India Company, is this specific to Manhattan, or would it have encompassed all the other settlements in Kingston, Albany, et cetera? Yeah, these, excuse me, Kief's War wasn't restricted to Manhattan. Outlying areas, it was in the lower part of the colony. It didn't extend all the way up to what's now Albany, to the territory of the Haudenosaunee. But there were all these outlying areas. I was talking about 2 settlers whose property was destroyed. That was on Long Island. So, excuse me, it was on Staten Island. So, yeah, it extended throughout the area. Someone is asking if the Flushing Remonstrance is in the show. No, we did not request the Flushing Remonstrance. Could have done that, but you only have room for so many things. Let's see. Were cemeteries provided in the Castello Plan? Cemeteries. Well, there was, I ought to know this. The church was in the fort, and there was a burial ground attached to the church, but I don't know that that was the only cemetery. Now, later, or actually at the same time, I know that up in Stuyvesant's Bowery, they begin to bury people there. So on people's estates, they buried people. And in fact, what's now the Church of St. Mark's in the Bowery was on Stuyvesant's land, and Stuyvesant himself is buried there in the foundation of the church. Let's see here. Excuse me. Were there schools for African Americans when the Dutch or English ruled the colony? I do not know of schools. Some Africans learned that, certainly they learned Dutch. They also knew African languages, and they would then have learned English as well. How they were schooled is something that may be known, but I don't know the answer. I would point you to 2 people. Andrea Mosterman has a really good book called Spaces of Enslavement about slavery in New Amsterdam and early New York. And Nicole Maskill also has a book out in the past year or so called Bound by Bondage. So the answer may be found in one of those. Let's see. What made the Dutch colony give back to the British? Okay, you're asking the second time. The reason I smiled is because the book that I'm just finishing now will be called Taking Manhattan, and it's about the English takeover of the Dutch colony, which was a very complicated, what exactly went on there was very complicated. And in the process, I would summarize it by saying that in this negotiation, where these English ships have guns pointed at New Amsterdam, and in the fort in New Amsterdam, they have their cannons pointed at the English ships, and they're about to, lay waste. Instead, they start negotiating. And in this negotiation, I think they come to realize that this particular section of English society and this particular section of Dutch society, what they had created in New Amsterdam, that they can work together and they can make this place into something interesting. So that I think my argument in that book is that New York ultimately became an invention, and it was invented by this group of people. So that's what I think you're referring to as the first time. So the question, though, is what made the Dutch give the colony back to the British the second time? There was in 1673, so 9 years later, there was a brief period, a number of months, in which there was a Dutch takeover again. So New York reverted to Dutch control, and then the English took it back again. I think the short answer to that, it's a very complicated situation, but the short answer to that is that that was done sort of outside the authority of the Dutch government, and the Dutch government didn't really want to do that. Their attention was elsewhere. So it was kind of a freelance takeover. And whenever that war between the Dutch and the English ended, the negotiation resulted in it reverting to England. Were there schools for Africa? Oh, I already read that one, sorry. Did the Lenape own slaves? I do not know the answer to that question. That's a good question. I'll bet it's in Robert Grummet's book. I'll bet you can find the answer there. What court was deciding the cases you referred to? The government in New Netherland was a council. It was the director, so Peter Stuyvesant and his council, and they acted as sort of the executive and the legislative branch. So Stuyvesant would make rules like he was the governor, and then he would sort of switch hats and they would adjudicate cases. And something similar happened in the case of New Amsterdam. They had a city council which would function as a legislature and as a judiciary. Was their money system based on loans like we are today? Yeah, but I mean, people put down, my understanding is that people put down, you had to put something down for it. I don't know that the Dutch at that time would, give you a loan based on almost nothing. They were very savvy businessmen. Were there other issues like the Flushing Remonstrance that were brought to the Dutch authorities in Amsterdam? I think what you're asking is whether cases had to be sort of went over the heads of the people in the colony. And yes, there were instances where in the home country they would overrule, basically, or they would support the people on the ground. One more question: how does the depiction of the purchase of Manhattan in the Museum of Natural History match up to our view today? What that purchase was is a great question. We don't know. I urge you to read the Lenape statement to get a clear idea of how the Lenape today view that. I think it was something like a defensive alliance that both parties understood they were doing. But there's a lot of information about how these events were structured. There was a lot of there was days of talking. People on both sides would have lots of chance to talk out their side and what they wanted and so on. And once an agreement was made, there was feasting. There was a lot of eating and drinking. So in terms of the feel of it, I think we have a sense of what that was probably like. The trickiest point in so many historical questions is what was in their minds. What did these Europeans think that they were doing? Did they think that they were essentially swindling the native people, or did they think we're entering into something, and who knows, a year from now or 2 years from now, whether it will still hold. I think we're at the end. Thank you all very much for being part of this. And I want to thank you again for your support of the New York Historical Society. And I very much hope that you can come to see New York Before New York, the Castello Plan of New Amsterdam, which opens tomorrow and will be on view through July 14th.